Do you really hire people like her? Those were the words that shattered Jessica's world. In a single moment, a powerful customer's disdainful comment led to her being fired on the spot. Her dreams and confidence crumbling as she was forced to walk away, humiliated and uncertain of her future.
Welcome to True Tales Authentic Emotions. I'm Emma Blake. Let's explore another unforgettable story together. Enjoy.
Do you really hire people like her? The words echoed through the restaurant, cutting through the background chatter like a knife. William Thornton, a powerful businessman, looked Jessica up and down with cold disdain, his voice dripping with arrogance. The weight of his words was palpable, making everyone around him stop and listen. It wasn't just a question, it was a condemnation. In that moment, Jessica's fate was sealed, and the life she knew began to crumble. The restaurant, once a place of hope and possibility for Jessica, now felt like a prison. As William's words hung in the air, the owner of the restaurant, eager to please his influential customer, approached Jessica with a look of regret. He didn't need to say much. The decision was already made. Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She was being fired on the spot, not for any wrongdoing, but simply because she didn't meet the superficial standards of a man who held all the power. Jessica's world came crashing down around her. Just moments ago, she had been serving customers with a smile, thinking about her dreams of finishing medical school and helping her ailing mother. Now, all of that seemed like a distant fantasy. Humiliated and defeated, she was forced to walk away from the job that was her lifeline. As she stepped out of the restaurant, the weight of her uncertain future pressed down on her. Everything she had worked so hard for was slipping away, and she felt utterly powerless to stop it. Jessica's heart pounded as she looked at the stack of bills on her kitchen table. She had spent the entire day searching for jobs that could fit around her demanding medical school schedule, but every door seemed to be closed. With her mother's mounting medical expenses and the cost of tuition, the pressure was unbearable. Jessica's once bright dreams of becoming a doctor were now overshadowed by the fear of losing everything she had worked so hard for. After hours of relentless searching, Jessica found herself at yet another dead end. The few jobs that were available either required hours that conflicted with her classes or paid far too little to cover her expenses. Her frustration grew with each rejection, her hope fading as the reality of her situation became more apparent. She was trapped, and the weight of her responsibilities was becoming too much to bear. Jessica knew she had to keep trying, but with every passing day, her future seemed to slip further away. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Jessica sat down at her desk, staring blankly at her textbooks. The words blurred together as her mind raced with worry. How could she possibly balance school, work, and caring for her mother? The future that once seemed so bright now felt impossibly distant, and the fear of failing her dreams and her family gnawed at her relentlessly. Despite her determination, Jessica felt herself sinking deeper into despair, unsure of how much longer she could hold on. The rain poured down relentlessly as William Thornton drove through the dark, winding road. His thoughts were far from the road ahead, consumed by the pressures of his business and the deal that had just fallen through. His phone buzzed beside him, drawing his attention away for a split second, a moment that would change everything. As he glanced down at the screen, the car skidded out of control. Tires screeched against the wet pavement, and in an instant, the vehicle collided with a tree, the impact violent and unforgiving. The once powerful businessman now lay unconscious, slumped against the steering wheel. The shattered glass and twisted metal told the story of a life hanging by a thread. The rain continued to fall, washing over the wreckage, as the distant wail of sirens approached. William's world, once so carefully controlled, was now in ruins, his fate resting in the hands of strangers. The ambulance rushed through the city streets, red lights flashing against the dark night. William remained unconscious, his breath shallow, his life slipping away with every passing moment. As they neared the hospital, where fate would intertwine his life with Jessica's once more, the paramedics worked frantically, aware of the critical condition their patient was in. The urgency was palpable, every second counted. The emergency room was a flurry of activity as William was rushed in, his life hanging by a thread. Jessica, an intern known for her dedication, was immediately called into action. She worked alongside the team, her hands steady, her focus unshakable. The stakes were high, but Jessica's calm under pressure was undeniable. Little did she know that the man on the table was the one who had so cruelly humiliated her not long ago. She didn't need to know. Her commitment to saving lives was unwavering. Hours passed in a blur of effort and concentration. Jessica's skills shone as she assisted in stabilizing William's condition. Her determination was palpable, a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. To her, this was just another patient in desperate need, and she gave everything she had to ensure he had a chance at survival. The team's success was a testament to their collective effort, but Jessica's dedication stood out, marking her as a truly exceptional intern. Jessica sat by her mother's bedside, her heart heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. The hospital bills were piling up, and the doctors had made it clear, without continued treatment, her mother's condition would deteriorate quickly. But the resources simply weren't there. Jessica's income as an intern barely covered her own expenses, let alone the mounting medical bills. The thought of having to remove her mother from the hospital was unbearable, yet it loomed over her like a dark cloud. As days turned into nights filled with sleepless worry, Jessica found herself at a breaking point. The strain of trying to balance her studies, work, and her mother's care was becoming too much. The very dream that once drove her now felt like a cruel reminder of all that she was about to lose. Dropping out of medical school seemed inevitable. How could she continue when the most important person in her life was slipping away? The walls were closing in, and Jessica felt powerless against the tide of desperation that threatened to engulf her. William slowly emerged from the darkness of his coma, his mind groggy and disoriented. The sterile smell of the hospital filled his senses as he blinked against the harsh overhead lights. Confusion gave way to clarity as a nurse gently explained the severity of his accident and the efforts made to save his life. He had been unconscious for days, teetering on the edge between life and death. The reality of his situation slowly settled in, but the true shock was yet to come. As William lay there, absorbing the gravity of what had happened, he asked about the people who had saved him. The nurse hesitated for a moment, then mentioned the young intern who had been instrumental in his recovery. William listened carefully, his heart sinking as he recognized the name. Jessica, the same Jessica he had humiliated and cost her job. The revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. His life had been saved by the very person whose life he had nearly destroyed. As William lay in his hospital bed, the weight of his actions began to sink in. The arrogance and thoughtlessness that had once defined him now felt like chains around his conscience. He replayed the events in his mind. The moment he dismissed Jessica with such cruelty, and now, the realization that she had been the one to save his life. A deep sense of regret washed over him, and with it, a resolve to make things right. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to mend the damage he had caused. Determined to find Jessica, William began to ask the hospital staff about her. Each conversation only deepened his remorse as he learned about the struggles she had faced since losing her job. The guilt gnawed at him, but it also fueled his determination. He knew that finding Jessica was just the first step. He needed to show her that he was truly sorry and that he would do whatever it took to help her reclaim her life. The search for redemption had begun, and William was ready to confront the consequences of his past actions. Jessica stood in the hospital hallway, her eyes distant as she stared at the wall, lost in thought. The harsh reality of her situation was sinking in deeper every day. Her mother's condition was worsening, and the bills kept piling up. The future she had fought so hard for seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Despite her best efforts, she felt powerless, overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities and the relentless tide of bad news. As the days dragged on, Jessica's hope began to erode. The stress of balancing her studies, work, and her mother's care was taking its toll. She found herself increasingly isolated, unable to share her burdens with anyone. The thought of giving up her dreams to care for her mother was a constant, gnawing fear. The isolation only deepened her despair, leaving her to face the crushing reality alone, as she contemplated the seemingly impossible choices before her. Jessica rushed into her mother's hospital room, her heart pounding as she took in the sight of her mother's frail body. The doctor had just informed her that her mother's condition had taken a turn for the worse. She needed urgent care, something Jessica could no longer afford. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, suffocating her with fear and helplessness. The reality of the impending financial ruin and her mother's declining health was almost too much to bear. As Jessica sat beside her mother's bed, tears welled up in her eyes. The once strong and determined woman now felt completely defeated. The financial strain had drained her savings, and the pressure of keeping up with her medical studies while managing her mother's care had pushed her to the brink of collapse. She was teetering on the edge, the walls of her life closing in as she faced the impossible choices ahead. Jessica sat in the quiet library, staring blankly at her textbook. The words blurred together as the weight of her decision pressed down on her. The dream of becoming a doctor now seemed impossible. The reality of her mother's condition and the mounting medical bills made the thought of quitting school and accepting her fate more real with each passing day. Her heart ached with the impending loss of everything she had worked so hard for. Later that evening, Jessica walked into her mother's hospital room, the decision to withdraw her from care looming over her like a dark cloud. The guilt gnawed at her as she saw her mother's fragile figure lying in bed. She knew she had no other choice. The thought of abandoning her dreams, along with the responsibility of caring for her mother, was crushing her spirit. She felt completely trapped, with no way out. Jessica sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of the decision heavy in her heart. She stared at the small suitcase on the floor, the one she had reluctantly started to pack. Her dreams of becoming a doctor, of making a difference in the world, seemed to fade with each item she placed inside. The thought of returning to her hometown, defeated, was almost too much to bear. But with her mother's health deteriorating and no money left, it felt like the only option. As she zipped up the suitcase, a wave of despair washed over her. Jessica felt utterly alone, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The life she had fought so hard for was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hopelessness that had been building for weeks finally broke through, leaving her with a sense of resignation. She was about to give up on everything she had ever wanted. Jessica and her mother sat quietly on the bus, the city skyline fading into the distance as they made their way back to their hometown. The weight of defeat hung heavily in the air. Jessica's once bright eyes now held a dull, vacant expression, her thoughts consumed by the loss of her dreams and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The life she had fought so hard to build seemed to be slipping away, and the hope that had once driven her had been all but extinguished. As they arrived at the small, familiar town, a deep sense of despair settled in Jessica's chest. The streets, once filled with memories of childhood, now felt like a trap closing in on her. She looked at her mother, who seemed frilier than ever, and realized that the life she was returning to was far from the one she had envisioned. The future seemed bleak, and the past few years of struggle felt like they had been for nothing. William, filled with regret, sat at his desk, determined to find Jessica. He stared intently at his computer screen, using every resource at his disposal to locate her. His face, usually stern and composed, was now softened by the weight of his guilt. He knew he had to make things right, and the first step was finding her. After hours of searching, William finally discovered where Jessica and her mother had gone. The realization hit him hard. She had returned to her small hometown. With a renewed sense of purpose, William decided to go there himself, determined to make amends for his past mistakes. William, driven by the need to make amends, finds himself frustrated as he hits roadblocks in his search for Jessica. Every lead seems to end in a dead end, and the more he searches, the more he realizes the extent of the harm he's caused. The weight of his past actions bears down heavily on him, pushing him into deeper reflection. As the days pass and the search continues, William feels a growing sense of despair. The guilt that once gnawed at the edges of his consciousness now threatens to consume him entirely. Each failed attempt to find Jessica is a painful reminder of the consequences of his arrogance and selfishness. As William struggles with the mounting pressure of time slipping away, a sense of desperation takes hold of him. The fear of failing to find Jessica in time overwhelms his thoughts, leaving him restless and determined to explore every possible lead. The realization that his window of opportunity is closing fast forces him to push beyond his limits. Despite the countless setbacks, William refuses to give up. His regret fuels an unrelenting drive as he exhausts every resource available, tirelessly searching for any clue that might lead him to Jessica. The weight of his past mistakes becomes a crushing burden, but it also ignites an intense resolve within him. William's heart pounds as he finally uncovers Jessica's location. The revelation hits him like a wave, bringing both relief and an overwhelming sense of urgency. He knows this is his chance to make amends, to try and right the wrongs of his past. He prepares himself mentally and emotionally, aware that this meeting could change everything, for better or worse. With determination in his eyes, William begins to gather his thoughts and resources. This isn't just a physical journey, it's a path to redemption. The weight of his actions sits heavily on his shoulders, but he is resolute. As he sets out, the anticipation of the encounter with Jessica fuels his every step. As William prepares to confront the consequences of his past, he takes a moment to reflect deeply on the impact of his actions. His thoughts linger on Jessica and her mother, recalling the suffering he indirectly caused them. The weight of this realization bears down on him heavily, filling him with a sense of urgency and remorse. He understands that the damage done cannot be undone, but he is determined to make amends, no matter the cost. With resolve hardening in his heart, William vows that he will not allow his past to dictate their futures. He knows that finding Jessica is only the first step. The true challenge lies in proving that his remorse is genuine and his intentions are sincere. This is his final chance to set things right, and he won't let it slip through his fingers. Jessica feels the weight of her mother's worsening condition pressing down on her every moment. The reality of losing the battle to save her mother becomes painfully clear, as each day brings a new challenge that seems insurmountable. Jessica's spirit, once filled with hope, now teeters on the edge of despair, struggling to find a reason to keep fighting as the future grows darker and more uncertain. As she looks at her mother, frail and pale in the dim light of their small apartment, Jessica feels a deep, overwhelming sense of helplessness. The future that once seemed so full of promise is now shrouded in uncertainty, with no clear path forward. Every effort to save her mother feels like it's slipping through her fingers, leaving her in a state of quiet desperation. Jessica's world shatters as her mother's health takes a sharp turn for the worse, pushing her to the brink of despair. The urgency of the situation leaves her paralyzed, overwhelmed by the crushing reality that she may lose her mother despite all her efforts. The sense of hopelessness deepens, and Jessica feels herself sinking into a void where every glimmer of hope is extinguished. As Jessica sits beside her mother's hospital bed, the weight of her fears and helplessness becomes unbearable. She knows that she has done everything in her power, but it seems to have been in vain. The thought of losing the most important person in her life is a pain too deep to bear, and she is left feeling as though she has reached the lowest point of her life, with no way out. The moment William stepped into the small town, he knew he was close. Guided by the trail of information he had pieced together, he finally arrived at the modest home where Jessica and her mother were staying. The air was thick with tension and regret as he approached the door, each step heavy with the weight of the past. William's heart pounded as he knocked, unsure of what he would say but knowing that this moment could change everything. When Jessica opened the door, her eyes widened in shock and confusion. William stood before her, a man broken by his own mistakes, tears welling up in his eyes. In that moment, all the pride and anger he once held vanished, replaced by pure remorse. He fell to his knees, pleading for forgiveness, his voice trembling as he offered to pay for her mother's treatment and cover her college expenses. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and Jessica felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. As the reality of William's offer sank in, Jessica's mother, frail and weak, appeared in the doorway. Her presence, once a symbol of the burden Jessica carried, now seemed lighter as hope returned to their lives. William's gesture wasn't just about money. It was about redemption, a chance to make things right. The three of them stood together, tears flowing, as they realized that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with healing, forgiveness, and the promise of a brighter future. As the days passed, Jessica realized that William's offer was genuine. He had arranged the best medical care for her mother, who was now receiving the treatment she desperately needed. The sense of relief that washed over Jessica was overwhelming, but so was the emotional toll of the past months. She had been through so much, and yet, here was a new chance. Not just for her mother, but for herself as well. William had not only provided financial support, he became a constant presence in their lives. He attended doctor's appointments, checked in regularly, and offered emotional support when things got tough. This was a man transformed by the weight of his past mistakes, now determined to make amends. Jessica found herself gradually opening up to him, seeing not just the man who once wronged her, but the man who was now working tirelessly to set things right. As her mother's health improved, Jessica began to think about her future again. The dream she had of becoming a doctor, which once felt so distant, now seemed within reach. With William's encouragement and support, she re-enrolled in her classes, determined to complete her studies. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was no longer alone. William's redemption was not just in the money he provided, but in the time, care, and dedication he showed. He had become a mentor and a friend, someone who truly believed in her potential. The bond that formed between them was one of mutual respect and understanding, a relationship built on the foundations of forgiveness and trust. In the months that followed, Jessica excelled in her studies, driven by a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a daughter fighting for her mother's life. She was a young woman reclaiming her future. William's support had given her the stability she needed to focus on her goals, and with each passing day, she felt stronger and more confident in her abilities. The day Jessica graduated from medical school was a day of triumph for both her and William. As she stood on the stage, looking out at the audience, she spotted her mother smiling proudly and William standing beside her, tears in his eyes. It was a moment that encapsulated all the pain, struggle, and eventual victory they had experienced together. William had redeemed himself, not just in Jessica's eyes but in his own. He had found a new purpose in helping her achieve her dreams, and in doing so, he had found peace. Jessica, now a doctor, was ready to face the world with the knowledge and compassion she had gained through her journey. Together, they had turned what once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle into a story of hope, forgiveness, and new beginnings.